Okay, now for our interview of Dave Beaty, director of the Nimitz Encounter. I started by asking him to tell us how the project got started.
Really going into it, my perspective was telling this story because my whole film and the whole research began right at the beginning when I first heard about it, in the late 2017. And then at that time, I don't think a lot of people knew about the story, and even after the New York Times article. So I started piecing all the things together. And, in doing so, in coming up with this little recreation, a bunch of people started coming out of the woodworks contacting me saying, hey, I was there. I saw it. So these I guess, out of the woodwork, these other witnesses came forward that weren't part of the official story. I mean, none of these guys that contacted me were in any of the official media reports, not mentioned at all. And I started uncovering all these other little details that, in some ways lined up with the official story, but in some ways, diverged, especially if there seemed to be U.S. Air Force involvement or, military confiscating data and so on, which led me to think that, if this was a UFO and they didn't know what it was, why were officials boarding the ships and taking data like immediately right after this event? That sort of like made me think, well, this could be possibly some type of terrestrial technology that was advanced, maybe Air Force or advanced, aerospace platforms that were being tested out there.
Right.
So,
right.
I mean, listening to all your guests, I go down that path a little further and think, wow, with the ESM and these swarm drones and false radar hits and all of that.
Yeah, it seems like that's definitely a legitimate third option. I think it was T.D. Barnes that we had on the show, who is this guy who was a longtime Area 51 employee and talked about some of these technologies that they were employing at that time and how they would test those technologies and test them against our own systems and so on. But in talking to many of the folks that you've spoken to, so we've now recently spoken to P.J. Hughes and give me the Gary Voorhees and Kevin Day. Yeah. So we've now interviewed all of them. And to go back to where I was, you've got this first question of what is this? Then for us, we've gone down this kind of hole of these claims that Turber made on our show, which we've been investigating, which is basically like absolutely positively 100% this is secret U.S. Air Force technology. He knows this because of a AV specialist who was part of the briefing that shared this information with Turber way back when. Turber didn't make much of it at the time, and then later when the videos were released, I think he went back and had further conversations with the guy and kind of confirmed that's what it was. And then Turber went on to make the astounding assertion, albeit being a bit cagey about it, that he actually has seen one and flown in one. Did he share that part of the story with you?
No, actually, that's the first time I heard it. So again, and one of the things that the other witnesses that have talked to me that were on the ships have said over and over, they always have said to me, there's no way, Dave, that the Navy would do that to us. They wouldn't put us in a operational test without letting us know, or somebody at least that was around us. I mean, they said that over and over. Kevin Day, the operational specialist in Combat Information Center, the senior chief, that was there, he said that they didn't do it. He's a 17-year experienced Navy guy. He said that it would be too dangerous to put the crews in that kind of situation. Now, if it's electronic, spoofing radar, then I guess you could say, well, come on, that's not dangerous. It's not even there. There's nothing really there. I want to add a number 4 to your little scenario there too, and that is there is a training simulation mode that the Aegis system can use that will allow a trainer to introduce tracks within the system, within the radar system, that are not there. And it's basically used to simulate drills. If they wanted to have a MiG fighter or something coming in, or a missile or something like that as a simulation, they trained on that all the time. It was think about it. That's a great opportunity to set up what they were doing out there off the coast, basically, TSTA, or Tailored Ship Training Availability, and Comp 2X is a simulation. So during that few weeks out there, they're simulating sub attacks and enemy fighters coming in. And, this Aegis system did have the ability to put false targets on their display. Now, you could think if, well, let's do a test where we don't tell anybody that it's a simulation. This is some new evolution that they're going to evaluate the crew in an environment where they're not revealing that it's a simulation, But Kevin has always, while he admits that capability was there, he's always said that the Navy wouldn't do that. They wouldn't, produce a training where no one was briefed going into it that this was a simulated training situation. And he says that the Tic Tac events, that was not the case. It was not a training. It was not a test that the Air Force was doing against the Navy without telling them. So, I put those guys' statements and you have to also look at the commander, Fravor, and Lieutenant Kurth, and all these guys who are out there, Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Kurth and Jim Slate. They've all sort of said that this wasn't a training thing, that they were aware of. They wouldn't do that. In fact, they a few of them kind of got upset with that idea that it would be what they term blue on blue, because as an air crew going out without having any prior knowledge of another air vehicle being out there is a safety of flight issue. So without being briefed, they figured that wouldn't happen. So again, I don't know.
Yeah, well, what argues against, obviously, the spoofing technology is the eyewitnesses, right? And the count of the number of eyewitnesses, from my count anyway, seems to be going up. I'm curious what your count is. When we interviewed P.J. Hughes, who was working with the Hawkeye, he reports that he's got this guy who he referred to as Roger, I think, in your documentary, and since, this eyewitness friend who says absolutely that he saw it, and that Roger essentially says that all 5 people on board that Hawkeye saw it with their own eyes. So there's 5 plus Fravor and Fravor's co-pilot, and then I presume both members of the other F-18 that was out there. I don't recall their names, but were they both eyewitnesses as far as you know?
Yes, Jim Slate would have been the backseater, the weapon system officer of the wingman jet in Fravor's flight. The front seat officer was a female pilot that appeared in the Unidentified show in silhouette. Her name has not been released, and she doesn't want her name released at this time. So there's 4 air crew in those planes. Now, there is a little contention about the Hawkeye airplane and the 5 crew members that are aboard that. The fighter pilots, especially Commander Fravor, disputes that. He says that from his understanding, none of those airplanes saw this Tic Tac, and only his flight had visual eyes on. In fact, he disputes that the Kevin Day and Gary saw anything through the binoculars on the warship USS Princeton because it was simply too far away at all times from the battle group. So he says that couldn't have possibly happened, although Kevin and Gary maintain that they also saw the Tic Tacs based on their experience of walking up to the radar system. And again, this wasn't during the Fravor intercept. This was after it, maybe a day after, or, not at the exact same time, a different time. They walked up to the radar. They found one of these hits that they had been observing for a week, went upstairs to the bridge wing and took a bearing of that direction. They knew it was probably 20, 30 miles away, and saw these little white lights on the horizon, basically in the same position of these objects. So whether that correlates to 2 more visuals, they believe that they were looking at what they saw on the radar, which were these same objects.
Yeah, there is that unfortunate conflict between the stories that hopefully those guys are all going to get in a room at some point and rectify, because they seem like kind of silly disagreements. As far as the binoculars go, they call them the big eyes, and it seems to me these big eyes absolutely can see that far, and that Fravor would have no idea who had gone up to that deck to use the big eyes to look for this thing, especially considering, as you point out, they had been seeing these things for about 4 days before Fravor goes out there.
Yeah, and one of the things I've been trying to get these guys all in a room. We all have. I know Tim has made efforts there as well. Tim McMillan, who was on your show, to try to reach out to these pilots to say, why don't you guys just talk to each other? I set up a conference call with Paco Chirichi and several of the surface warfare guys, PJ and Gary, and just tried to have them talk. But there was this brick wall that was put up that I saw. No discussion was possible. They were wrong. They didn't. It was absurd, the idea that they saw a Tic Tac from the bridge wing of the ship, because Paco said the closest that the Tic Tacs ever got to the Princeton was 100 miles. Somehow he knew this based on the report that he read. Remember the report he had in his hand? He says that the Tic Tacs never got any closer, and there was actually only one or two, I think, or three or four the entire week that they tracked on radar, instead of the numerous ones that Kevin claims that he saw and that they were looking at. So, I mean, I tend to side with Kevin Day and Gary, who are actually physically present in CIC, and they both corroborate what was going on. In fact, all of the witnesses on the Princeton that were there were saying that these objects were seen almost a daily basis in groups within CIC. If they had a reason to be in there, they would see the stuff going down on the screens, especially Gary, who corroborates Kevin's testimony that there were, during a week, up to 100 objects they witnessed, not 4 or 5, up to 100. Now, again, this is a separate ship. The fighter pilots were not present on the Princeton. They didn't see what Kevin and Gary saw. So their contention that it's impossible for these guys to have seen them with the big eye binoculars, I'm saying, why not? I mean, if they saw a track that was 20 miles away, they could go up there and, at dusk, if these things were illuminated, especially they would be able to see those things with binoculars. They'd be tiny little specks, I'm sure, but to my understanding, they could have seen them.
Yeah, and they kind of report essentially that they were simply tiny specks. Yeah. So I think you and I are on the same page on that. I'm tending to believe Kevin and Gary. What about going back to the Hawkeye and whether the airmen on the Hawkeye saw it?
Yeah, so I had a personal interaction with the airman that we're calling Roger. Actually, he's an aviation technician, in-flight technician. And in the beginning, I got some pushback from Paco saying that, that's impossible. The only people that are ever on the E-2 Hawkeye are naval flight officers. You don't have enlisted or petty officers on these planes. So I went back to PJ and I did find out that, yes, indeed, there was a training program or a naval program called in-flight technician, where petty officers that were aviation technicians would fly on the Hawkeyes and provide a sort of needed service, which is to identify any problems that might be going on. So these guys were trained in all this, the SAR type waterborne rescue. They had to go through this special training to be able to fly on these Hawkeye planes. And indeed, the gentleman that I spoke to, I kind of checked out his background and did vet him that he was indeed in this program. He did fly in the Hawkeye. So I know that this guy is real. And the reason why he didn't want to come forward was because he said that, according to him, he had to sign some secret. He had to sign a document right after the incident that said he wouldn't talk about it. So even going out on a limb and even mentioning it to me was sort of a little, sketchy for him. He didn't want his name used. He literally said, "That's all I have to say about it. Please don't contact me again about it." And what he said was that, yes, indeed, during the same flight that Commander Fravor, intercepted the Tic Tac, they heard the radio calls through the communication network, with the Princeton and Fast Eagle flight. And at that time, the entire air crew witnessed one of these objects form up on their plane for a few seconds and then take off. And, I kind of recreated that in my little documentary, where I showed what maybe it looked like, based on his description. So he said that when they landed, and he said all 5 air crew in that plane would have seen this object. They were present and they knew what they saw. So he said when they landed, they sat on the deck for 20 minutes in what he called was a hot refueling state. He said it was sort of unusual in a training evolution to sit in your flight gear with the engines running on the flight deck in the E-2, because, number one, you're burning fuel, and if you're going to take off again, that would make sense. It just didn't make sense that they sat there. And then, when they did get permission to shut down, they didn't go to their normal briefing room, the ready room where they might do a normal debrief of their mission. They went to this other area that he described it as a secure briefing room, where they were told not to talk about it. And this is allegedly where they signed these documents. We've asked him, does he have a copy? And he's like, no, they didn't give us copies. And it wasn't really a volunteer type thing. Hey, do you mind signing this? It was, sign this and don't ever talk about what you saw. So,
and I imagine he didn't share the names of the other airmen that were on board?
No, I mean, Patrick knows most of the people that were there because he, was a member of the Wallbanger Squadron, and Roger knows who was there. So I think that some of these people have been contacted, and so far no one else has, agreed to speak. One of the interesting things that has come out before any of this, this happened, I guess, in 2018, all the Roger and PJ and everything. Before that, there was a document that was an investigative report called the Executive Summary that was leaked by George Knapp of KLAS. And this is we call it the 13-page Executive Summary Report. And that report is a pretty specific document that describes interviews with crew members of almost every ship, plane, submarine, you name it. And they interview somebody that allegedly was on the E-2 Hawkeye that Roger would have been with. And in that statement, he says that they did not see any Tic Tacs. They tried to get a radar return on one of the Tic Tacs, but it was almost impossible. I think they said they got a radar return on it, and then they thought it might be wave tops because of the high sea state. But again, in that document, it doesn't say anything about seeing any Tic Tacs or even getting a radar lock on from the E-2 Hawkeye. So,
are we sure that would have been the same Hawkeye flight?
Yeah, according to the executive summary, the interviewer specifically says that this was Banger, the Hawkeye that was originally going to control Fast Eagle before Princeton took over the control of the flight, but they were the ones airborne. And this, I think it was a lieutenant that was. PJ told me he wasn't a pilot in the front of the plane. He would have been one of the guys sitting with Roger, and they know this guy. They all know him. He said they say it was their division commander that made that statement. But PJ and Roger both say that that's incorrect, that they did see a Tic Tac visually. And according to PJ, that the Hawkeye actually at one point did hold a radar contact. Now, here's an interesting fact. They could not open the windows like in the back of the plane if the radar is on. And it's just like a little bit of trivia that I learned that there are RF screens that they have to put down. So if the Hawkeye's big dish radar is operating, they would never have the windows open, so they wouldn't be able to see. But they can put the radar in standby and then open the windows. And they said that's what they did.
The 13-page executive summary was prepared by whom or what entity?
It's sort of a mystery, but George says that he was handed this document at a briefing on the Hill when he was there with former Senator Reed. So he went to some type of briefing, and at that meeting, he was given this document, apparently, to release to the public, or at least it was a document that's redacted. Now, I think that George had the version that was unredacted. I don't know that at the time it was redacted, but somebody went through that document and took out all the names. So we don't know exactly who's mentioned in there. I was a little confused because in the part about the USS Princeton, it mentions a senior chief fire controlman with 17 years experience. And that sounds like Kevin Day, and even the little redaction looks small. And I've subsequently found out that indeed was not Kevin. There was another guy that was aboard the Princeton at the same time that, had a very similar story to what Kevin, in his story lined up with Kevin's. And in the meantime, those two gentlemen have connected since I found that out, which is interesting. He doesn't want to come forward at this time.
And so was George Knapp at a briefing on the subject in D.C.?
He was from what I understand, he was at a briefing with Senator Reid about ATIP. And again, this is, before the whole reveal with the New York Times and the Politico and so on, when that article came out, talking about black budgets and glowing auras in this Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification program. So it was right before that, there was some type of meeting where he was invited to participate, and he was given this this document, which, Paco said, because I sent that the day that came out, I sent that to Paco Chirichi, and I said, hey, have you seen this? Is this the same thing that you have? Because he said his document was an ONI sourced investigation. And he said it's similar, but not the same.
ONI, sorry, is what?
That's the Office of Naval Investigations, I think. Okay. ONI.
Okay.
And so that's the Navy's investigative arm. And I believe that Paco, said that the document that he had was ONI source document. And actually, on your show, I believe he mentions that it's also an ATIP document. So he kind of used those two terms to describe this, I think it was 20 or 30 pages, the thing that he had. And he said to me that it was more granular and more detailed than the 13-page one.
Well, what I can tell you is since that interview, Mike Turber sent us something, and it's 13 pages, and we sent it to Paco to say, hey, Paco, is this what you had in your hand during the interview? And he said, yes, it is. Mm-hmm. So Paco saying what he had was the 13-page document, which and it starts with executive summary. It almost seems as if the heading has been redacted because it doesn't start at the top of the page, and there's nobody's emblem at the top. There's no Navy symbol or anything. It just says executive summary. Is that the version you've seen?
Well, I'll send you guys after the show the one that was released by KLAS in May of 2018, I think. George did a whole story on it with the I-Team investigative reports, and here's this document, and he holds it up, and then the PDF was out on his website, and it may be the same one that you guys have, and it may be what Paco had, because he's maintained that this other document that he had was either sensitive or had some level of clearance associated with it. I asked him who gave it to him, and he told me that he goes, well, I can't tell you. The person that gave me this document asked me not to say who gave it to him. So, yeah. But it is the same, but I think that the one that Paco based his article on may have been even longer or more detailed. Again, I don't know.
So, yeah, there's a number of briefings. It'd be interesting to do a little timeline of briefings on this thing because we just learned for the first time, maybe you probably already knew, but Kevin Day told us that he had a lessons learned briefing in San Diego after they went to port. Did you remember him telling you about that?
What came up with me was a gentleman contacted me and said, Dave, I was on the USS Nimitz during that week in November 2004. Said my job was in the CDC, which is similar, the Combat Direction Center, which is similar to the CIC on Princeton, where it's where all the radar screens are, and it's a darkened room where they plan combat operations on the carrier. And he said that he was sort of involved in that department. He said, did you hear about the meeting after this workup at Sims Hall, SIMS Hall in San Diego at the naval base? He actually said it was the anti-submarine warfare base. So I looked that up real quick on Google, and sure enough, there's this Sims Hall. And I said, no, I never heard of that. What was it? And this is email between me and him. He said, well, the people that were involved in this incident were told to report to Sims Hall after we arrived in port for training. But once we got there, we found out that this was all the people, the pilots and the senior chiefs and the officers and so on that were part of this UFO were there. And they were actually, some people took the stage and talked about it for a little while. And they said, yes, this was real. and don't talk about it. So they didn't sign anything or, weren't sworn to secrecy, but they were just warned, please don't talk about this. So that's the extent of that information. Now I asked Kevin, I go, were you there, Kevin? Did you go to Sims Hall? And he said, I don't remember that, but we do have the lessons learned after any workup where all of the officers get together to kind of replay what went right and what went wrong during the training.
Exactly. Yeah, that's what he shared with us.
Yeah.
Was the lessons learned briefing that he did say that Fravor was at. And yeah. I think he said that these Tic Tacs came up, but it wasn't the primary purpose of the meeting.
I mean, it's been a long time. Maybe that's the same meeting. It sounds similar to me.
And then you have the disagreement about whether data was taken or not, with Fravor adamantly saying nobody boarded the ship, nobody took anything.
Right.
And you just kind of wonder why he speaks so definitively of that, because the Hawkeye was not under his command. He can speak definitively that nothing was taken from him, but P.J. Hughes kind of reported that, well, you don't really need anything off of the Hornets because everything is on the Hawkeye data bricks. That because they're out there in support of the Hornets, essentially, if you wanted to go to one place to get everything, the place to go is to me and to get those bricks. But how do you suss out this further disagreement?
I mean, I just want to say that I totally respect Commander Fravor. He's an American hero. I mean, his track record in Navy aviation, it speaks for itself, really. I mean, what he says is the truth. He's not lying about any. I mean, he was a senior commander. He was a CO of, the Black Aces BFA 41 fighter squadron on an aircraft carrier. I mean, he's a high-level naval officer. I mean, his point was, look, I was in all of the briefings with the captain, with the commander of the air wing. We talked about this stuff. I was in, with intel. No one mentioned anything about an investigation. No one seemed to care. They were laughing about it. So that's his whole take on it, that how could people come and I would know about it if that happened. But, when I start thinking about classification levels and need to know, and Air Force people like kind of cloak and dagger showing up, and taking stuff, maybe that did happen. And if so, maybe they didn't tell anybody. Maybe that was the whole point of it, is like, we're taking this information, keep your mouth shut. Whoever was kind of there leading them around the ships. Now, if it was just one incident where because PJ was down in his work area, he didn't see any Tic Tac. He didn't know anything about anything that day when these guys showed up. He was just doing his job, and he thought it was odd. Why are two Air Force guys showing up taking my data bricks? And it was just weird. Like, sign them out because, they won't be coming back. You're not getting these bricks back. So after that, that conversation I had with PJ in the very beginning, I went back to Gary, and I recalled a phone call I had between myself and Kevin Day when we were first, kind of contemplating this film and some of the recreations I was doing in the radio. And I said, Gary, didn't you tell Kevin that you had to sign out your tapes to somebody? He goes, yes. I go, well, why didn't you tell me? And he said, because you didn't ask me. I go, come on, Gary. Like, all right, I get it, Gary. I didn't ask you about knowing about people taking the tapes. But he said, yeah, that around that same time, people arrived via helicopter. Most likely that's how they arrived. And he was part of the crew that, had to be there as a firefighting crew during the helicopters when they would come in. So he knew these helicopters were coming in, and he was called downstairs as the chief technician for all the computer recording systems. He literally had to sign out I guess they were like these, he said they were almost like 8mm, or not 8mm, but 8-track tapes. He goes, there were digital tapes, not hard drives. And he goes, that's what we recorded on these digital tapes. And he had to sign them out to his CO, who was with these two guys that were, he said they were in plain clothes. He didn't notice any Air Force insignia, but there were two guys. And I said, was that unusual? He goes, highly unusual. And I said, well, what else did they take? And he said, well, they wiped out the CEC. which, you know, I don't know if you brought that technology up in your show before, or Gary or these guys, but that's called a cooperative engagement capability. It's the technology itself is classified. The name of it isn't. You can find it on the Navy's website. It's just called the cooperative engagement capability. And what I've learned about it is it's a beyond visual range or beyond line of sight type of targeting system that combines radars from the entire battle group. So it's a very sophisticated computer system that takes all the radars from the planes and ships and puts them all into one display, so to speak, so that even the Hawkeye might be able to see what the Princeton's seeing and use its radar and so on. And it allows planes to go passive where they're not emitting radar energy, but still see radar. It's being fed to them through some secure link, something like that. That's, you know, a brief idea. And he said that these guys were very interested in that technology. It just so happens that that same technology was on the data that was on Patrick's E-2 Hawkeye. And in this case, they are hard drives. He said that on the E-2 Hawkeye, what they took, he called bricks. They're called removable memory cartridges. Removable memory cartridges are RMCs, and they contain communications, like radio communications. They contain CEC data, and they also contain ESM data, which is a sort of RF signal intelligence sensor that, like, I guess, focuses on the radio frequencies that are coming towards the plane and can discern friend or foe, and it has signatures that it looks at. So it's looking at the radio spectrum and recording it. It's a very interesting technology, especially if it was some weird Tic Tac object that was emitting any kind of RF spectrum stuff. So all of that was taken as well. So here's two guys that are corroborating to me the same type of events of taking stuff, and these guys that showed up. Now, recently, a third gentleman approached me via email and said, "Hey, Dave, you know, I wanted to tell you that I was involved with the helicopters that were part of a detachment on the USS Princeton." His name is Ryan Weigelt, and, you know, I conducted an interview with him and vetted his, you know, Navy background and so on. And he was one of the lead petty officers of the HSL 43 Battle Cats. And it was a detachment of SH-60 Seahawk helicopters. They had several helicopters, I guess 2 helicopters on the USS Princeton that he oversaw as far as maintenance and taking care of them. He wasn't a pilot. But he said that he witnessed these guys, these Navy guys, boarding the ship and so on. And he went into even more detail in his account about, you know, he saw them carrying these bags with materials, and they went into he said, the admiral's quarters on USS Princeton. So, I mean, the story just keeps kind of evolving, you know.
Did he say they were plainclothes?
You know,
because that's what Gary says, right?
This is the first time I interviewed him. He said that they were wearing standard issue Navy flight suits. And he said that this would be anybody that's going to fly aboard one of his helicopters, no matter if they are getting aboard a helicopter, they'd be giving these just generic sort of flight suits that are Navy. But he said that underneath the flight suits, it was his opinion that they were Air Force guys. And I
okay, hold on. Let me be clear, because you said aboard the Princeton. Are we talking Princeton or Nimitz?
Princeton. His helicopter detachment was on Princeton. And I said, well, do you think that these guys went to Nimitz to get PJ's data bricks and came back to your? He's like, yes. He goes, my helicopter squadron was flying these guys around, collecting this stuff.
I mean, it does kind of make sense that it would be the same 2 guys that went to the Nimitz that went to the Princeton, but the way PJ and Gary's stories line up, it's PJ somewhat definitively saying Air Force air suits, and Gary saying polo shirts.
Right. They both are very, you know, I guess, sure of themselves. But again, I mean, if you ask me, what were this guy wearing 14 years ago? You know, I don't know if I would remember exactly if it wasn't that important to me, you know. Yeah. I mean, did it happen? I think that the taking of the data happened. Who took it? Whether it was Air Force or, you know, some senior Navy guys, or even, you know, in a lot of these cases with some of these sensors. And let me just back up like one step and say, you know, you can say that did not happen, but I always look at it from the perspective of, well, what if these were industry representatives or aerospace company representatives, that it was their equipment that was on these ships, and that unbeknownst to anyone else, they were just coming to get some testing data that's completely unrelated to UFOs. It's just like they're showing up at the same time and like, you know, okay, hey, you know, this equipment we have that we're testing on your ship, we want to get the recordings from it because we're doing some software revisions or something. But to say that these guys are lying, that didn't happen, you know.
Well, they both pretty definitively thought for sure it was getting picked up as a result of what had been seen. So now you've got, sounds like if you put Ryan into this, you've got 2 out of the 3 saying it was Air Force, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's super interesting whether or not it was Air Force, because especially in light of what Turber told us, because Turber's telling us definitively this was U.S. Air Force craft. So that would seem to connect the two, because I imagine it's not super common for Air Force to be on the Navy vessels. No idea. I'm sure it happens. Mm-hmm. So that connects those 2 stories, except the other explanation potentially for Air Force is that apparently, and I forget which one of those guys told us this, but apparently when there is anything kind of unusual or unidentified in the skies, that's Air Force domain. So if for 4 days Navy's been seeing these things and they're unidentified, and et cetera, that for the Air Force to take over whatever investigation there may be of it, that would kind of make sense. Does that ring true with what you've heard?
It makes me feel that way. I mean, you know, obviously you could say it's an Air Force advanced aerospace platform being tested against the Navy's strike group. You know, I think Turber's saying that's what this is. And T.D. Barnes as well could say, you know, this could be what we're looking at here. You could also say that, well, perhaps the Navy was unsure of what these tracks were. They didn't have IFF transponders. They're operating in this military operations area, and perhaps they contacted the Air Force, you know, to find out if they knew anything about these objects. There was always something in the back of my mind, because I remembered somebody had mentioned this a long time ago, and I thought it was Fravor maybe. And basically what the statement was, yeah, during that week, you know, the senior commanders couldn't figure this stuff out. They even went to the Air Force to ask for help. And I couldn't remember who made that statement. And after reading Tim McMillan's article on Popular Mechanics, I finally saw the quote, and it went back to 2007 with this guy, this anonymous guy on above top secret forum called The Final Theory, the guy that actually leaked the video in 2007. And in his statements, you know, describing what this video represented in this event, he said that the Navy contacted the Air Force for help. And that was the first time that those 2 things ever, you know, came together. And, you know, in the last couple months, I know that some of the videos were investigated, the leaks were investigated by the Air Force's, you know, OSI, right? The Office of Special Investigations of the Air Force. So they looked at some of the leaks of these Navy videos, and it's sort of odd. From what I understand from the Freedom of Informations that were done, it wasn't the Nimitz one, but they did the AFOSI looked at the leak of the 2015 videos, Gimbal and Go Fast, which kind of odd, you know?
Mm-hmm. What about Gimbal and Go Fast? Have you been digging into those also?
You know, we did look at it. I mean, going back to the beginning when they were first released, the first thing that we wanted to know was, where did these videos come from? You know, what do they represent? Where back in the beginning of 2018, no one knew. To the Stars was tight-lipped about it. None of the reports mentioned anything about where, I think, and then little dribbles of information came out that said, okay, this was on the East Coast. They would say, okay, this was from the East Coast. That was all. A little bit more and more information came out. A bunch of researchers, and myself included, started looking at all of the evidence of where a carrier strike group might have been off the East Coast in 2015, because we found out that was the year. So we had the year in the East Coast, and we started narrowing it down. We eventually found the USS Roosevelt carrier strike group off the coast of the East Coast. And we were looking at all the evidence in the videos, including the wind speeds aloft. I think the guy said the winds are 120 out of the east or something like that, and he's at 20,000 feet. So we started putting that into the weather soundings, the weather balloons for the entire year, and the weather patterns of the clouds and the whole thing. We actually narrowed it down to within like a week of, and so then I got a freedom of information out for the cruiser, which was the Normandy, USS Normandy. And so I put I kind of threw a net out there, and I said this 2-month period between January and February 2015. And so I got the deck log released to me of the cruiser. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't mention anything about UFOs, but it does have a latitude, longitude position of where it's at. So using that data, we were able to figure out where the thing took place. And, it was actually kind of off the coast of Georgia. If you go straight off the coast of Georgia, maybe 100 miles off the coast, that's where I believe that happened. Now, that doesn't show where the airplanes were, but the cruiser's normally about a mile from the carrier during, workups and so on.
Have there been FOIA requests to the Navy about those incidents?
Yeah, I mean, there have. I know that a lot of the researchers have been trying to get the logs of those ships and any kind of data. So far, it's been very sparse. Specifically, I think it's so new that a lot of it's classified. A lot of the documents are not released. The summaries of the aircraft logs and the communications and so on. We tried to get just the deck logs are the most prosaic sort of, what time they turn the lights on, what speed, direction the ship is going at. So we tried to get the deck logs of the ship, and they wouldn't release those. They said that because it's a nuclear aircraft carrier, the Department of Naval Reactors has say over what is released, and they wouldn't release the deck logs of the USS Roosevelt.
What about like pilot? Do we have pilot names from those incidents?
Well, we do from the New York Times and that television show that TTSA produced called Unidentified. They have 2 of the pilots that were involved, and then they say that they knew the other ones. I guess it was Lieutenant Graves and Lieutenant O'Coin were 2 of the guys that were involved, and their friends allegedly were the people in the cockpit that filmed those 2 videos. They didn't do it themselves, from my understanding, but they know the guys, and that those guys so far have not wanted to come forward.
But sorry, the other 2 are on record saying they saw it?
I think that they were present for these events, but they weren't present for the events that, again, these details are a little sketchy. It's not the case that I'm really following so much, but I know that they were there, and that this stuff was happening like the entire time they were seeing them. And it went on for a period of several years where they and their friends would encounter these objects off the East Coast.
And do you have, obviously they're very similar to what was seen and recorded off the Nimitz. Do you have any reason to believe that what they saw was anything different than what was seen off the Nimitz? And I'm asking that because Turber actually claims that they are slightly different technologies.
Yeah, the descriptions are vastly different structurally. To the, in the video that we have, gimbal looks like some type of spinning top, and they talk about the spinning top. In the go fast, it looks like a little sphere. And actually, these 2 pilots say that's kind of what these things look like. the thing that is interesting is those two videos, according to what my understanding, were filmed on the same day, which I think it was January 20th, 2015, something like that. I may have the date a day or two off, but that those two videos were both filmed on the same day. Now, Lieutenant Graves, one of the F-18 Super Hornet pilots from the USS Roosevelt, says that what actually occurred, we see a little piece of that video, but what actually occurred was that there was a whole formation of these little objects, like a V. He describes it as a V formation with this spinning top thing in the middle of that, and that they were following the spinning top thing, and that it actually did a 180-degree turn in formation, and that the video that we have is of like one of these little sphere things and then this spinning top. So it looks different than the Tic Tac. Obviously, it's not a cylinder. And they go on to describe these other objects, which I think it was it's like a cube inside of a sphere. I mean, that's another detailed description they give.
But exhibiting the same properties, defying gravity, supersonic speeds.
No visible means of propulsion, no control surfaces, no plume.
Right, which could fit a theory that there has been this breakthrough discovery of gravity-defying technologies, and that has been perfected through the U.S. government, through multiple private contractors. So Raytheon may have built one, and Lockheed may have built the other. They're both using the same technology, but the implementation is a little bit different.
Well, I mean, you get all of my friends on your show, and aviation historian and researcher Nick Cook, who I met like a couple of years ago. I was fascinated by his work, and his book is specifically, he wrote a decade or so ago, looking at that as an aviation journalist. He was following this trail for a long time, and from my understanding, Nick said he doesn't believe it. He just can't connect that dot from where we were in conventional aerospace technology to that we've cracked that secret.
From what he was able to learn as to where we were, because I'm with you, but then I learn about these black projects and the $30 billion per year that's being spent on them, and so on. And what I've been surprised by through our investigation is people bringing to my attention various projects in U.S. military history that were in fact kept secret for dozens of years.
Yeah, I mean, in his book, one of the things when he visits Lockheed, one of the last things before he walks out the doors, he notices on a whiteboard the word Astra written at the top. And then he recalled that it was April 1st, and these guys are just messing with me, that the Astra, is a real project or something like that. But I mean, obviously that's a topic that's been going around for a while, that this TR-3B Astra, this triangular shaped craft that has some type of AG properties, is a real device. I have no clue, but
yeah, but serious studies of it. I haven't read his book, but as you know, we interviewed him, and there's some pretty serious people that were investigating this, and it's going back now. I think he says started with some Nazi experiments, right?
Yeah, I mean, he went and said, well, maybe some of this technology was discovered after World War II, and the Germans actually had this breakthrough technology. He didn't find anything, although some of it's sort of interesting. The henge, up there near Poland, the Polish border, with this underground mine, and they thought that this thing called the Bell or the Glock was there, but it's all sort of rumor and conjecture, and not a lot of evidence other than, tales about it. Some of the advanced aerospace guys in Germany, I did a documentary about the Horten brothers that actually developed these all-wing fighters and prototype bombers that went on to look very similar to conventional aircraft, or sort of unconventional aircraft that were developed here in the 40s and 50s by Lockheed and some of the other aerospace companies that were these all-wing, flying wing. And of course, now we have the stealth fighter, the B-2, and so on, that, I think that looks like a direct lineage from the Horten brothers, in Germany post-World War II. So,
whatever it is, it's going to be incredible if and when we find out about it. So we might find it incredible that it could have been developed by the U.S., but it's going to be just as incredible if it turns out that it's extraterrestrial or some type of spoofing technology or what have you.
I mean, it's an incredible mystery. It's like one of the most intriguing mysteries that I've ever encountered. And when you have so many witnesses to these Navy, experiences and events from 2004 and 2015, the story keeps evolving, and the ending hasn't been written yet. People continue to email me that say that they have evidence, from both events, and it's sometimes difficult to sort through what comes through, because I get emails, people saying that it's, definitely there's Zeta Reticuli that are, communicating with us in some type of, transdimensional, light ship or something. But then, I'll also have people that say that this is secret, U.S. military technology as well. And I'm always looking at the evidence. I haven't come to any kind of conclusion, which I think is the best stance to take in any of this stuff, because the U.S. Navy says this stuff is, these are, UAP.
Right.
And that means they don't know.
If it was U.S. technology, does it make sense to you how the military has been utilizing it thus far? I mean, we know at a minimum it's been around since 2004, probably earlier than that. So that means, they've had it for a couple decades, yet haven't put it to any public use that we know of.
Well, I mean, consider the conundrum of having a secret weapon that's so secret that you cannot use it. So you sit on it and you say, how many lives could have been saved if we had the secret weapon that's so remarkable that we could defeat pretty much any aircraft that's flying in the skies? And then you also look at it from the perspective of, okay, so say they do have this, but what about the commercial aviation industry? And we're polluting our planet with greenhouse gases, and we're sitting on these huge, gas guzzling aircraft for 14 or 15 hours flying from point A to point B, when we could have solved a lot of this problem if we did have this revolutionary, paradigm changing aviation, anti-gravity stuff. I mean, I would hate to think that they actually had it, but they're not sharing it, to save our planet.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, it would have to be someone's decision to make this public.
Right.
Right. So who does that rest with? Ultimately, is it the commander-in-chief? And
well,
yeah.
I mean, yeah, you think of all the jobs you'd kill, think of all the industries you would kill. I could see that it could be a big problem if somebody suddenly discovered the secret to anti-gravity done cheaply.
Well, and some type of incredible new type of power generator that's nuclear based, yet is able to operate at room temperature, et cetera, right?
Right. I mean, think of all the problems that, T.D. Barnes talked about, that nuclear rocket. They couldn't use it because it was too dangerous. I mean, it's spewing out radioactive emissions, every time they fire it up. So anything that's nuclear, even if it's a small device, like it's some type of micronuclear power source, if the thing ever crashed in a ball of flames, I mean, now you have a fallout situation wherever that happened. So there's always going to be a problem with releasing that if it does have a potential of a safety concern with nuclear energy. So
yeah, you probably would have all kinds of internal disputes as to how to perfect this, which company is going to get the ultimate contract for this, what exactly are we going to use it for? Is it going to be for commercial purposes, energy purposes, military purposes? And then I do think it probably would be up to the commander-in-chief to decide that and to go public with it. So now you've got politics involved because a president is hearing about it. So, let's say you've had 3 presidents now or more, you got Bush, and then you got Obama, and now you got Trump learning about this. Probably, hey, great to know, But hey, give me some more reports as to how you suggest we release this information. You're going to want all kinds of impact reports as to what about this, and this. And at the end of the day, you're going to think to yourself, well, I could go public with it, but what really do I have at this particular moment to gain? We're not, as opposed to the atomic bomb in World War II, where you have an exigent circumstance, right? You have millions of people being killed. You've got the domestic U.S. being threatened, and you've come up with this incredible technology. Mm-hmm. You'd say, hey, this isn't time to be sitting on this. This is time to use this. We don't have that type of circumstance going on right now.
Right, that's correct. I mean, if you look at the use of, the atomic bomb in Japan, I think that there was estimates of probably 1 million U.S. service members would have lost their lives if they had pursued that campaign past Okinawa, if that had continued into the Japanese homeland. So, I mean, there are those types of technologies that were held in secret then, and until they were used, I don't think anyone in the world, except for a small group of people in that project, knew of the existence of that. So is it possible that we have done the same type of thing now with this technology and ferreted it away into, the Atomic Energy Commission or, the back then, which, some people say that's where this stuff is, that it's, one of the most secret, organizations there is. So it's FOIA exempt. You can't even get inside any of that. Well, one of the things that I think about, here's another part of the Navy encounters. Aside from what we do know, there's got to be some really good radar data, and the CEC, that stuff exists. What does that show? Because, you can say, well, it was, Kevin describes it, but doesn't the government have that? I mean, hopefully they didn't just erase all of that information, because they didn't need it anymore, and 2 years were up and they don't have to keep it, so they just erased it all. You would imagine that data exists somewhere, and all the intervening years, any of the stuff that has continued to go on, very high resolution data should exist along with the pilot statements, along with visual and cameras. I mean, hopefully that if it's not our advanced technology, that they're very, very concerned with what this radar is showing these things doing. If Fravor, says it went hypersonic and he saw it with his eye, like going faster than any airplane can go, the radar should have picked that up. Or you see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
there's some very compelling evidence there with, 5 ships with radar and all these planes and the E-2, and they're all like focusing on it. So
last couple questions. What people were talking about, the 10-minute video that's in much better quality. You think we're ever going to see that?
I don't know that it exists. I mean, from my understanding, that videotape that Chad Underwood filmed in the second flight of the Black Aces, the Fast Eagle, went out. He says that their standard operating procedure was to turn on the recording as soon as they begin the intercept. So he said flights on, tapes on. So according to him, there was a longer tape. So when they landed on Nimitz, allegedly this tape was taken to the Intel Center, and these guys would make copies of it. And is there a longer tape? Was there ever one in existence? I believe there was. Did they edit it down for some reason? They take one little piece that was more releasable. Did the final theory only take that? I mean, I think that piece was released on the ship's secret LAN. That's the piece that went around to everybody, saw it on the ships that had access to that. Somebody leaked that out, and that's the piece that we have today, the same little piece. Is there a longer one? If there is, it's going to probably be in the same place with the communications, the radar, the CEC.
But the Navy, in the FOIA request that we all learned about recently, their response, they talk about an additional video.
Right. I mean, but if you look at that document, it could be the same video. In fact, when the next question went to this Susan Go, the DoD spokesperson that's kind of handling this stuff. She said that yes, the Navy does have this video, but it's the same length as the one that has been in circulation. So it's my personal belief that in that FOIA that just came out about the top secret slide presentation and this video, that it may be the same one we have.
And that slide presentation, do you have any information as to when that presentation was given and to whom?
I don't, but one more correlation with the guy on Above Top Secret. He was the one that mentioned the Air Force back in 2007 in these posts he was writing, in the same, the same type of commentary on Above Top Secret. He mentioned that there was the files that he had was a PowerPoint slide presentation, this video that was released, the FLIR video. At that time, he called it, I think it was called F4 EBPEG. And he had one other video that he was never able to get to play. So he had 3 files at that time. We haven't seen the slide presentation that he had. I'm not sure why.
Well, Turber says that his contact, the AV specialist, was part of the presentation, and that there was a debriefing that was done, and I believe the timing of it was soon after the incident. So
yeah, I mean,
those two line up.
That would be incredible. I did read, that description that he was putting together, all the pieces of the puzzle, so to speak, to create a presentation. I mean, that would be an amazing presentation to be briefed on.
Yeah. And then last thing, the captain was James Red Smith, and some of these guys, I think it was both Kevin Day and Gary Voorhees both reported that he was pretty nonplussed by it, very cool, and maybe even laughing it off or what have you. And he now is, let's see if I've got it written here. No, I don't. But his current position is he's somewhere in Africa in some type of intelligence position. He was the commanding officer of the Aegis cruiser USS Princeton and air defense commander for Nimitz Carrier Strike Group at the time. Anyway, I have a theory, since I'm kind of going down the Turber track, that high level they were in on it. So the captain would have been in on it. The admiral over on the Nimitz would have been in on it, but perhaps not below that level, and that hence explains why these guys were acting somewhat callous about it.
I mean, obviously, if this is need to know, like unacknowledged special access project aircraft, they're not going to brief like anybody except it's directly needs to know. And that might be, like you said, the commander of the ship, and he's not going to be talking about it outside of the people above him. So it's possible. At the time, I don't know if Kevin told you, at the time, the captain told him that he believed it was high altitude ice particles. That's what he said that the radar was picking up. And of course, that doesn't explain the visuals, but that was his take. And years later,
Kevin said he laughed at that. Kevin laughed at that. So
right, he said it was absurd to consider that. But I guess after that, he was contacted, and he said he didn't remember the incident.
Yeah, so I just brought it up. Red Smith, Foreign Affairs Specialist for Africa at U.S. Naval Forces Europe and Africa, Commander 6th Fleet. So I was going to ask a related question, which is there one interview for your next Nimitz Encounters when you update your great documentary? Is there one interview you're really chasing that you want to get?
Well, I mean, I think the whole Roosevelt case is just intriguing, and it hasn't really been thoroughly explored. We know very little. A lot of these guys are still active duty, and I have a couple contacts that were there that have, basically said, look, I'm working for the Navy now. I'm, active duty. I have a clearance. I can't really talk to you right now, but once I'm retired or once I'm out of the Navy, I might reconsider that. So, I mean, that story to me is fascinating. I could do a very similar recreation. I would love to do a similar recreation with that event as well.
Yeah, well, you did a great job with Nimitz Encounters. I'm sure most of our listeners have probably already seen it, but we'll be put posts up to it and so on. And yeah, I would love to see you do one about the East Coast. I hope you're making a little money off of these.
Not really. You know, as strange as that seems, when I first started doing it, it was just a personal project. I watched it, recently, and I said, it's a little rough around the edges. But I said, look, I got to give myself credit because pretty much I did everything. I didn't have any funds. I was doing it on my off time and the weekends. I was, and so when I released it, I'm just like, look, I just made it for free. I'm just going to put it on the internet. I never really expected to have that much traction. We're over 4 million views now with it. And, I was blown away. But at the time I put it out there, I'm like, I'm not going to monetize this. So
that means YouTube has paid you $1.78 so far.
It's big fat zero. So
is it truly a zero?
Yeah. I mean, I'm like, if anyone wants to use it, they can share it on their channel.
But wait a minute, why haven't you made any money off of YouTube ads?
Because I didn't monetize my channel.
Oh, you didn't turn it on.
I just gave it to everybody. I'm like, you don't want an ad on my video. It's fine. You can have it. And I do make a little bit on Amazon. So if you want to watch it on your smart TV, you can pull it up on Amazon Prime Video, and I make a little bit off that.
Well, hopefully History Channel, Discovery Channel, etc. are watching, because they've got to be doing additional programs on this. What was the one called that was on History or Discovery?
Unidentified.
Yeah,
America's UFO investigation.
Oh, they're doing a second season.
Yeah.
And then, of course, I'm sure you've learned that some of your buddies, including Kevin, and I think PJ and Gary, but are doing this expedition. They said come December, they're going to put some ships out there in the same region around San Clemente Island and see what they see.
Yeah, I mean, they've sort of given me an open invitation to participate with that. So, if it works out, I would love to also check that out.
I just told them don't be public about when you're going to do it, because if this is U.S. craft and they don't want to be seen, they ain't going to be out there at that time. So I would think
That's
that
true.
you'd want to be quiet about when you're going out there. I don't know. It's probably a long shot that they're going to see anything anyway, but.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing that they came up with, I think Kevin specifically, was the migration pattern of whales was sort of the impetus. Like Kevin, identified the fact that these whales migrate through the Channel Islands going southward down Baja. And he thought, the UFOs seem to follow that same pattern. I wonder if there's some correlation between migration of whales and these UAP objects.
Yeah.
So,
well, check out the Turber interview. You're gonna enjoy it. I can leave you. It's kind of long, so if you got limited time, we'll email you the part where it gets really interesting, where he starts implying that he actually rode on one, and it was a cross country trip that took 84 minutes. And when you ask why 84 minutes, why wasn't it half a second? It's because the G-force would have been too strong. So he basically flew as quickly as you could in one of these things without the G-force wreaking havoc on you, and then kind of describes the inside of it. 4 seats on the inside, etc. So it's pretty fascinating. He showed me on his phone his Google Maps going from Palmdale, because he claims they're all made in Palmdale, Plant 42, and by these major contractors. And essentially riding from there to the East Coast for a briefing on it. Now, I've since fooled around with my phone a little bit with Google Maps to see, could you fake that on Google Maps? And actually the answer is you absolutely can. It's actually fairly easy to go into your Google Maps and change destinations and times and so on. So the fact he had that on his phone turned out to be less impressive than I thought it was at the time he showed it to me.
Yeah.
He definitely, his information for the most part is checking out. That particular claim, is fascinating, but this whole story is fascinating. So most people kind of roll their eyes a little bit about that claim, but then again, this whole thing is so unbelievable that just toss one more thing into the pot.
I mean, I vote that Commander Fravor should get to fly one. That's what he said. He wanted to fly one. So, I mean, I think we should all vote him in. So like,
yeah, well,
he can dogfight one.
According to Turby, you don't get to fly it; you're just a passenger. So it's
okay.
It's basically a drone, right? So somebody else is controlling it, but
okay.
According to Turber, it can take passengers. It's not very comfortable and not really designed for that at this point, but it is theoretically possible for people to ride in it. Of course, it cannot go at the incredible speeds that it's capable of, though.
I mean, I so want to believe that. I really honestly do want to believe that we have that type of technology. I mean, that would be incredible, life-changing for all of us.
Yeah, I agree. I hope it's ours and not anybody else's. Michael, do you want to?
He didn't say that on the show, though. He said that to us privately.
Which part?
All of what we just discussed.
Well, actually, I just re-listened to it. He said more on the show than we remembered. He talked about what it looked like on the inside. He didn't say the 4 seats, though. Right. What Michael's talking about is, so we're kind of close with Turber,
record or something,
and we had beers afterwards, and then after a few beers, I'm kidding, it wasn't after beers, but during a couple beers, he put more meat on the bone for us as far as that, but he just said that that's classified and
yeah. Well, I mean believe me, a lot of these cases take a similar track, but they're ET based. First the guy sees the UFO. Next thing is, he didn't tell you about the time it landed in his backyard. Now, the third time that he went to the moon inside the UFO.
Yeah. Michael has warned me about that because he used to host a show that did some serious work on UFOs, and I'm more new to the subject, so I'm more I'm more gullible. But his part about his contact, the AV guy, that all keeps kind of checking out against the more we learn that seems to fit. I mean, I don't know where you are right now. I assume it sounds like you're kind of leaning toward it more likely being U.S. technology than anything else.
I mean, it's such a far stretch for me to, first of all, eliminate all prosaic explanations for what these guys witnessed. I mean, I would put that 90% of my ideas is that it's an earthly origin. Do I know what it is? I don't know. Is it some technology? Is it a machine? Yeah, obviously it is. So I lean that way. But then again, the UFO researcher side of me, that goes back beyond any Navy UFO thing, says that these craft have been observed for decades, hundreds of years in the United States, but it goes on way before that, really, if you look at sort of recorded history. And if you look at the cases, if you look at the data of these true unknowns, you come away going, that was real. What those people saw is real. And it has not been explained. And it's definitely, so it goes so far back that you have to say, the technology was being observed before we even had like airplanes flying around, like very rudimentary airplanes. So
yeah, and what was observed those many decades ago is in the same realm of what was observed by these guys.
Exactly, and just our sensors and our capabilities of imaging them, and every time we advance our ability to sense something. Here's something really interesting. The guys from the Roosevelt said there was a time when we couldn't see them, but if we turn on our infrared, we could see them. And we would approach these objects, and this is off the coast of the east coast of the United States. We'd approach them using infrared. We'd get a lock on these things. And then we get within like a mile of this object that's on our lock, that's locked on. And then they would look under the cockpit, and it's the same thing, and it's not there. So in other words, they could see it in infrared because the sensor capabilities had advanced in 2015, but they couldn't see it in the visible spectrum.
Infrared is reading heat. Is that correct?
It's just reading a spectrum of light or energy that's above our visual. I guess, again, I'm not a physicist, but it's just outside of the visual spectrum of image,
So they're using some type of additional cloaking technology, stealth technology.
Yeah, or it's the object itself is some type of energy that's outside of the visual spectrum of light. So it's in the infrared spectrum of light that it would be there, it'd be invisible. But then again, it kind of boggles my mind that could happen, because when he was saying that, I said, well, wait a second. If you guys are seeing these things in infrared, these objects in the sky, but you can't see them visually, that means they could be around everywhere, and that we couldn't see them because we're not using these high text sensors that the Navy has. And in fact, I researched that, and I found out that the Navy is using this thing called IRST. It's like infrared search and track, something like that. And it's called a Legion pod. And these Legion pods go on the underbelly of the strike fighters, and they're used in areas where they're being denied radar. They can't, either it's jamming or you're in a combat threat environment where you can't use your radar anymore. So this infrared's a passive system, but it can be used to engage aerial targets. So they were picking these UFOs up on this new technology. So, maybe that's why we're seeing them. Maybe seeing them because we're advancing our capabilities. Phased array radar, you talked about that so.
That is Turber's claim, is that with the expanded use of phased array radar, these things are going to start getting discovered more and more, and hence the reason why Navy's kind of in a position now to start acknowledging some of this, because we're getting closer and closer to learning what it is.
PJ Hughes is a really good guy, and I was talking to him about the Hawkeye, and they said, well, so I said, do you think that the CEC was, why they came and got your stuff? And he said, well, maybe there was something else. I go, okay, so so PJ, you're telling me you can't say anything other classified tech was on the Hawkeye, but it's possible that there was some. And he's like, yes. And he wouldn't tell me, but so. Yeah,
what I got from that, tell me if this conforms with it, is that if people were to have access to that data brick, for instance, what's on there discloses technology that the U.S. has that the Hawkeye is capable of, that is top secret. And
even to mention, right? Even to mention, like CEC is pretty classified, but you can say that, and they can talk about CEC. According to PJ, there's other tech they can't even say what it is.
Yeah, and he's making the point also to us that, hey, there's a lot of things that I know that you don't know and you're not allowed to know.
Right.
I assure you, based on the level I was in the military, there's a ton of other stuff that they know that I don't know. So,
I mean, and if you just look at that area, that training range out there, if you start looking at San Clemente Island, Tim and I had this discussion after looking at it, going, oh my God, you go on Google Earth and you look at it, you're like, there's some underground stuff over there. I mean, it almost looks like some of these little islands are almost like camouflaged to look like there's nothing, but there's like air vents and stuff. And I mean, it's a very, very highly classified area. It would be a great place to test secret aircraft out there. So.
Yeah. Well, we went from studying Epstein's private island to the government's private island on our show. So two islands that need some investigation. Unfortunately, a little late in the Epstein situation. But. Thank you again to Dave Beaty. You can go to Amazon Prime to check out the Nimitz Encounters documentary. Thank you to our producer, Michael Parker. We'll be back next week with another episode. And don't forget to become a truther on Patreon for just $5 a month and get the special Daily Star Mike Turber episode. That's patreon.com/Hidden Truth Show.
Thank you for listening to The Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow. You can find us at hiddentruthshow.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Truth Show. Join us again next week for another episode of Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow.